Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about A Course in Miracles, and my guest, Judith Skutch Whitson, is the president of the Foundation for Inner Peace, the organization which publishes The Course in Miracles. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You know, we were reminiscing earlier, one of the last times I was with you was about 12 years ago when we had dinner with Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford, who were the individuals involved in channeling these manuscripts which have become The Course in Miracles. And it must have been some experience for you to watch that material blossom and spread all over the world during these years that you've been involved. Why don't we start, for the benefit of our viewers, and talk a little bit about what The Course in Miracles is in succinct terms and how it developed and where it's grown.
We have a few hours.
28 minutes and 30 seconds.
Well, we'll start with what it is.
Oh, okay.
Basically, I could call it a metaphysical system of spiritual psychotherapy, which is a mouthful, I know.
Mm-hmm.
But metaphysical because it's dealing with not the world of form. Spiritual because it's addressing itself to spirit as our reality. Psychotherapy because it speaks of healing. And it tells us that we're all in need of healing because of a duality. And that if we were to look beyond the world of form, we will be able to see and experience what we really are, our true nature, which is spirit.
We're all in need of healing because we're in this world of duality.
Exactly. And all we have to do is look around us at the world that we call real, and see how much healing is necessary. And Mother Teresa puts it very well when she talks very simply about the need for love in the world. And she says the world is suffering from a terrible epidemic, and it's called spiritual deprivation. But thank God, she says, is a remedy. It's called love, and it's contagious. And A Course in Miracles, to me, is a definitive handbook on how to love.
Well, that's succinct. It's about 3 volumes.
It's 3 volumes, yes, and there's a text, and it sets forth the principles of A Course in Miracles. It tells what a miracle is, which is really a shift in perception, to be able to see what lies behind form and see spirit. And it has a workbook so that it can put into practice the principles that the text contains. And then there's a 3rd small volume, which is a manual for teachers, which is interesting because it addresses itself not to an outside teacher to teach you, but rather the teacher within, to reestablish that relationship with the teacher within, to help us teach ourselves what we already know.
Now, how did this material come into existence?
Once upon a time, in 1975, I should really start with my own story because otherwise we're going back too far. I was with a friend, in fact a mutual friend of ours, Douglas Dean, and living in New York City, and I was invited by him to accompany him to Columbia Presbyterian School of Physicians and Surgeons, where we were going to meet 2 medical psychologists. And the reason we were going to meet them, we really didn't know, except one of them had heard us speak and said he was interested in pursuing a conversation. At that time, we were very interested in healing and researching many alternatives there were to the medical model.
Yes, Douglas Dean is very well known as a healing researcher.
Right. And I had been teaching at New York University, and he was a teaching partner at times, and so we were very anxious to go up to what we call the establishment up at Columbia, physicians and surgeons. And when we met them, there was a feeling that I had that went beyond, how do you do, my name is. I sort of thought I knew them. Not that I had seen them before or anything, but there was a familiarity. I could say a family-like feeling. And I started to find myself saying things that I hadn't expected to say. In other words, opening up, and indeed, they felt the same way. and took us after a very nice lunch in the cafeteria to their inner sanctum, their office, where they locked the door and pulled down the shade and told us the deep, dark secret of their last 10 years, which had been, as the only word I have for it describes, of the material called A Course in Miracles. Now, the way it came to them was through their relationship. They had had a very long together period, teaching, researching, writing grant proposals, and their lives together and in their among their faculty wasn't very harmonious. In fact, they described it as one of the most stress-filled domains in the world, academia, medical academia.
Yeah, well, I'm sure
Yeah.
people who have been
Yeah.
there would acknowledge that.
I think every profession has built-in stress levels, but they had reached the pinnacle of their stress level. And one day, the quieter of the two of them, Bill Thetford, who was a very gentle man, a very thorough scientist, a very, very solid person, he just blew up. And he said in a very meaningful way to her so that she heard him, that he was sick and tired of the attitudes that stress seemed to have promoted between the two of them, and that they just weren't getting along, that there had to be a better way to live in the world.
There had to be a better way.
There had to be a better world. And he was determined to find it. And instead of laughing at him, because she was quite an acerbic woman, very clever, very sharp, the older of the two of them by 14 years, and this was unusual for him to be so emotional. Instead of laughing, she actually took his hand and she said, "You know, Bill, I think you're right. I don't know what the better way could be, but I'll help you find it." Now, to me, that's very important, because two people joined to find a better way of being in the world. In other words, to heal their relationship. And not too long after, Helen started to experience what she called heightened visual imagery. Being a psychologist, she would never say psychic or visions, but heightened visual imagery, which gave her the feeling that there was something within her catching her attention and very gently taking her along the way through experience to an opening up. In fact, after many of these visions, which were interesting in themselves, but I couldn't possibly relate them now, she started to become very familiar with an inner voice, which was very clear, unaccented, no sex, just a voice, which she said spoke with a gentleness and yet an authority she could not avoid listening to. And one day, after having had many of these kind of experiences, she was at home, unable to sleep, and she was actually feeling, hearing the words, "This is a Course in Miracles, please take notes." And she didn't know what to do. That was quite startling. She called up Bill on the phone and she said, "You know, that voice I told you about, it won't go away, and it's saying something very peculiar." And he said, "What is it saying?" And she told him, "This is a Course in Miracles, please take notes." And he's a very pragmatic fellow. He said, "Well, you've been having interesting experiences, which I've been taking down, so we have a record of them. Why don't you just do what it says? You take
notes.
very fast shorthand. Why don't you just do it?" So she did. And what she took down startled her a great deal, but she brought it in the next morning to the office before their staff came in, and they locked the door and pulled down the shades so no one should catch them at this. And she actually read from her notebook to him what she had taken down, and he typed it up, and then they discussed it. And it was an introduction to A Course in Miracles, and it said it's a required course. Only the time you take it is voluntary. Free will does not mean you can establish the curriculum, but rather the time in which you need to take it. And then it talked about the opposite of love is fear. But what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. And it also said the Course can be summed up very simply this way: nothing real can be threatened, and nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. Well, she was threatened. At that time, she called herself a militant atheist, and he was an agnostic. And here was something that mentioned G-O-D, and it just wasn't in her vocabulary. So he convinced her that it was beautifully written, and whatever it was, if it should happen again, to keep on doing it. And that began a 7-year collaboration, whereupon any time she wished, when she was ready, she could pick up her shorthand notebook and her pen and literally start from where she left off before without even checking what the book said. And in that way, with Bill typing down every day what she had taken down herself, A Course in Miracles came into being. It didn't represent the belief system of either of them, and yet it talked about healing and the healing of relationships, the reason for it coming. And that, in a nutshell, as succinct as I can make it, is the story.
Yeah. And it has subsequently literally transformed the lives of thousands and thousands of people.
Well, it certainly seems to. People who are drawn to it, and of course it's not for everyone, but people who are drawn to it and who have used it do claim that they have found a heightened peace of mind as they start to see the connection between them and someone else, and that when they recognize that they have really the same goal, which is to experience and to express love, that the barriers that they have put up to that love seem to disappear, whether it's family relationships or in the office, with the children, with neighbors, or even the other, which could be another country or culture.
And the Course seems structured in a very elegant and simple way. There's a thought that one concentrates on or visualizes one a day for 365 days.
Yeah, that's no accident. 365 is a special number. But I don't think it ever meant that the Course must be completed in a year, but rather it shouldn't be done in less. Because it really is an unlearning system. To unlearn the thoughts, the belief system that we hold, that we feel this world is finite, we've come into it for no reason whatsoever except biological. We have experiences, some joyful, some sad. We have some health, some illness, and we die, and that's the end. And this seems to be the belief system that many of us live our lives by.
Well, we get pretty locked into it.
We get locked into it. When we seem to have the witnesses that that is true. And yet, behind all of that, we feel the yearning for another home, a different home that we all seem to be familiar with in some strange and mystical way. We get clogged up with tears when we see a character in a film called E.T. say, I want to go phone home. Everybody starts weeping. Why? What is it that touches us so much? We really do know that there's something beyond this, something else. And when I say beyond, I don't mean out there. That within us is a knowledge that we have turned away from. And so A Course in Miracles' real purpose is to reacquaint us with that inner teacher, that inner voice. You can say the inner voice that Helen heard. There are interesting things about that, particularly since the voice did identify itself. I asked Helen that first day I met her with Douglas Dean when she showed me the manuscript, did the voice have a name, did it identify itself, such as the Seth material and others? And she said, I was afraid you were going to ask that. And Bill Thetford said, well, why don't you tell her, dear, she's going to read it. And she says, it says it's Jesus. And
this is a Jewish lady.
Yes, yes. And I said, well, is it? And she said, of course. Which was interesting because on the one hand, she didn't believe in it. But on the other hand, she knew it was true.
Yeah.
And I think we're all in that position in our lives. There's something that we know is true, but we don't agree to believe in it.
Well, you know, when I met Helen and Bill, they seemed like very humble people and very peaceful, and yet they felt like they themselves were probably the people who still needed to study the material the most.
Well, I think on the one hand that they knew that they had taken down something that was beneficial to people who wanted to use it. After all, they were two professors of psychology, and it came in a psychological spiritual model.
Yes.
Certainly the words in it, the terminology, is Christianity as we know it today, but the redefinition of many of the terms starts to bring a different interpretation, and at least for me, makes it the ideas come alive. So they knew what they had done was meaningful. On the other hand, they were embarrassed that they weren't total models of it.
But this Course in Miracles, it's something that many professional people who have a hard time relating to other spiritual systems but are looking for a spiritual system which they can relate to have done well with, isn't it?
I think that's true, possibly because it's a self-study course, that no one gives it to you. You can take it in your own time. It's voluntary. You're going to get it, the curriculum of life, sooner or later.
Yeah.
And you can choose that it could be sooner. And I think it's not threatening because of that you can do it at your own pace and you're not comparing yourself to anyone. Also, it's consistent. The logic in it
It's very rigorous.
Absolutely.
It's like looking at classical Buddhist logic or something of that
and
sort.
it's expressed in today's terminology. And we're all very aware today, particularly in this country, of psychology. A Course in Miracles couldn't exist without Freud. because Freud defined the ego. A Course in Miracles talks about the ego and then beyond. The ego, in A Course in Miracles terminology, is what I would call our little self, our personal self-seeking, everyday me identity, whereas the higher self, a capital S, is the inner self, which extends, which is love, where we find our peace. And so to me, A Course in Miracles is a very logical progression in Western psychology.
How have the various religious denominations and organizations responded to this material?
Well, as far as I know, no one really has organized religion responded. I mean, no one has called up and said, I represent organized whatever, but rather individuals from all walks of life in all different traditions have taken A Course in Miracles to be helpful to themselves.
I have had occasion to visit the Science of Mind churches, and I've noticed that you seem to incorporate it as a regular part of their structure.
Well, I'm Jewish and I incorporate it in my structure. And certainly the Course deals with Christian terminology.
Yes.
Someone asked me once, well, how come you're an identified Jew and you are studying a system purportedly from Jesus? And I could see no inconsistency because wasn't he?
A great rabbi. At least.
Well, my feeling is if one really wants to make friends with one's higher self, and everyone knows is there, otherwise who are we talking to all the time in there? Who are we asking advice of? If you really want to, all you have to do is say, I'm willing. A Course in Miracles has a nice quote. It says, show the slightest willingness, and 1,000 angels rush in to help. And we do get all the help we need when we open up to that willingness. And that voice is really ever-present and very available to us. And it very much knows what it is, who it is, and how to help us remember it.
One of the individuals who I know has gone a long way with this material is Dr. Gerald Jampolsky, who's written a book called Love is Letting Go of Fear.
Which is from A Course in Miracles, of course.
And he's used this in his work with children with terminal illness and helping them to come to terms with what they have to live with, to enjoy the last portion of their lives. And it's been quite successful, I understand.
Well, as the Course says, if fear is the opposite of love, but love is all-encompassing and therefore has no opposite, then love is our identity and fear is a barrier that we, our minds, erect ourselves. It doesn't matter if you have a terminal illness, or it doesn't matter if you're in extreme pain, or if you've just been fired from your job, or all the various ills that we can think of that befell us in our society. But if we can allow ourselves to remember that love, to demonstrate it to others, and thus to experience it, it's interesting how fear disappears. Then the dying process, since Jerry Jampolsky isn't talking about healing these people, he's talking about helping them be at peace with themselves, not even with the situation, finding the peace inside. Then remarkable transformations occur. The child can die, but the family retains something wonderful that was shared, and that lives on. Until we finally get the idea that love is letting go of fear.
Now, isn't a lot of this material at odds with some aspects of traditional religion and theology which talk about the need for sin and guilt?
The need for guilt, right.
Guilt, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that not so much at odds with, but to me it's the next step. We've defined sin and guilt. We know what it feels like. Is it helping us? I look around at me in my life because I like to measure everything, whether it works for me or not. And I see every time I have a guilty thought or feel that I have been sinful, I'm not going to feel good. I'm actually projecting what I'm feeling about myself onto someone else. And that doesn't make me feel peaceful and happy. But if I am willing to ask the in-self, the self that knows inside, the higher self, the Course calls it the Holy Spirit, how to see the situation, then readily I am shown how I can demonstrate love. Sin and guilt disappear when love walks in the door.
So in effect, what the Course is saying is it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, where you've been, that the presence of God, the presence of the Spirit is there now for you unconditionally.
Right. You can always be ready to say, I will, to Spirit. Which doesn't mean, by the way, that one should accept a point of view that doesn't matter what I do in this world, and hence I can commit terrible deeds against other people and myself. That's not what it's talking about at all, but rather to see mistakes rather than sin, because mistakes can be corrected, whereas sin really demands guilt and punishment. Mistakes are correction and, you can say, resurrection.
In other words, there's a difference between being responsible and feeling guilty.
Yes. But I would say the primary purpose of A Course in Miracles is to remember who you are through what your inner teacher, your higher self, the Holy Spirit, can teach you. Because if we decide every thought that we have, we would like it to be the thought from our higher self, we're going to be very peaceful people and act very differently in the world.
What are some of the other directions that the Course is taking now that so many people are involved? I know there's music, there are videotapes, there are posters, coffee mugs.
Oh, yes. In the beginning, I thought, oh my goodness, Helen, who died, by the way, in 1981, would turn over in her grave if she saw all of this. And yet, if people want to express these ideas in the various forms that manifest what they're believing in at this time, why not? The Foundation for Inner Peace, which publishes A Course in Miracles, doesn't have anything to do with that. If people want to use the material, why not? And I notice that some of the music is quite beautiful, and some of it I would even call inspired. Someone told me that she was writing a play based upon A Course in Miracles. That part, it'll extend in its own way, and in many other ways too that I can't even imagine, as the ideas of love will. But the project, if we can call it that I'm at this point the most involved in and dedicated to, is the translations. People from all over the world have studied A Course in Miracles in English. And when they've studied it enough, and when they feel that it becomes that person's particular function to bring it to the people who speak the language of that country, they identify themselves. In other words, we didn't say, oh, we've got to translate this material. It's nothing like that. It's rather people say, please, will you let us translate this material? And since there's no letting or not letting, but rather a joining, these individuals identify themselves to the Foundation for Inner Peace, which holds the copyright, and we work together. And there are 14 ongoing translations now. That thrills me more than anything, to see it coming up in different languages and know that it must be touching people because it's so alive.
Well, you've been very active in a number of ways. You've been active, for example, raising money originally for parapsychology research, helping to establish the Institute for Noetic Sciences, setting up meetings in Congress, as I recall, with futurists. The Congressional Clearinghouse for the Future was...
That's how I met my husband.
A project you were involved in. Do you see the Course in Miracles having an effect in the secular world?
I really can't answer that because it's a supposition, and I'm giving rather a power to a book rather than honoring the ideas. Rather, I would phrase the question, am I becoming more peaceful, more forgiving, less condemning? Because I know if I am, from the use of this material, then other people can, and they are. And do I see, person to person, that change, that transformation happening in others? Does the miracle of another perception, a perception that replaces the one that condemns us to alienation, aloneness, and illness, begin to fill up other individuals? Yes, I see that happening a lot. I couldn't say there's more change going in psychology or the traditional religions or drama or whatever, but rather that there are individuals in every walk of life who are using Course in Miracles or many of the other excellent disciplines to help them find that peace and extend it.
The Course in Miracles, as you mentioned before, it's an individual study program, but there are groups who work with it as well, aren't there?
I never saw any place in the Course in Miracles that said, get ye in groups. But yes, we're sociable animals, and people do like to come together to help each other study, to fathom. This is difficult material. Changing one's mind about one thinks one is. We hold on very hard to what we know and to the past. And in order to release those ideas and let a new belief system come in to take the place of the old, is sometimes threatening and frightening. And people reach out to others, and so they on their own form autonomous study groups. There are thousands of them. I have no idea where they all are. Once in a while we hear about them.
Mm-hmm.
And they come and they go. Maybe they meet for a while in someone's home. Maybe they meet in a church. Maybe they meet in a synagogue or in a school building or a hospital even, and help each other for a while, and maybe they finish and go on.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are long-term since the course first was discovered and still going. But again, it's so individual.
What do you think will be the long-term impact? It's only been less than 2 decades since this is going on, and we've really seen 1,000 flowers blossom, so to speak, with this work.
Well, I couldn't have predicted, Jeffrey, 11 and a half years ago that I could sit here today and tell you that in 1987, January, there were 300,000 copies of A Course in Miracles in circulation. I have no idea how many people study one copy. So I'm guessing over 500,000 folk at least are students of A Course in Miracles, and I have no idea how many others it's indirectly affected. So I don't know. I think we're probably laying the foundation along with many, many others who share basically the same point of view, but go about it in different ways. A foundation for a tremendous change of mind, which I call the Great Transformation.
The Great Transformation.
Yeah.
In other words, a new global direction.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I suppose if enough people can feel this sense of inner peace, this sense of inner connection with their deepest nature, then perhaps that can become a planetary reality.
There's no question about it. I think the best way for me to describe this isn't on the planetary level at all, but the individual.
Mm-hmm.
You, of course, with years of experience in the field that you've been in, and my touching on that field too, we believe that minds are joined and that information passes between us, whether we articulate it or not.
Yeah.
So when we look at a world that's not at peace, with factions fighting each other, with hunger, with all the other problems we have, it can be very depressing. But when we recognize in our lives that there's one individual at one marvelous moment, a miracle has happened without a word. We know the power of love, and we recognize it really can transform humanity. And I speak of, I could pick
Judith,
thousands.
we're out of time now, but I think you just said it. I think you really did reach that keynote to end on. Thank you very much for being with me.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you very much for being with us.